Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo Burya and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in.
Yes, let's do it. So let's talk about China today. So we talk about Xi Jinping and his power base, and start there, or where do you think? You listed 5 topics.
Right. I let me just quickly look at the topics. I think each of these is going to be like a pretty deep one. I sort of feel that maybe Xi Jinping will be like the right place to start. And also I am, happy to go like 10 minutes or 15 minutes longer so we have like a proper length episode. If we end up talking about interesting enough stuff for that.
Yeah, sounds good. 45 minutes is fine for me if it's a natural stopping point. But we'll it's good to know we have an hour as
okay.
Let's
do 45. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, let's start with in order to understand China, we need to understand its leaders. So why don't we start with the intro to Xi Jinping, and maybe we'll get to what people misunderstand about him or underestimate or misperceive.
Right. Xi Jinping is probably the most powerful person in the world. And if he is not the most powerful person in the world, he is the second most powerful person behind only the President of the United States. And people have correctly observed that he has centralized power within China to a degree greater than his predecessors. He is not just the president of the People's Republic of China. He is also the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and the chairman of the Central Military Commission of the People's Liberation Army. So, in other words, he wears more than one hat. And while we might overlook the institutional nuance of what authorities different positions hold within China, and we sort of round it off as just a dictatorship, these distinctions matter and have mattered in Chinese politics for a long time. Their previous system, arguably the one that they were using after Deng Xiaoping and all the way until Xi's ascendance, has been much more of like an oligarchic system, a committee system, where power is shared between senior members of the Communist Party. Xi is a little bit more monarchical in very important ways. When he rose to power, he was associated with the so-called Shanghai clique. So this was one that was presided by the former president Jiang Zemin, who was, basically in charge from 1989 to 2002. We could think of this as sort of the first era of Chinese globalization. And it was opposing the so-called League clique, which was led by, again, the former president Hu Jintao, who was president from 2002 to 2012. This we can sort of think of as the golden age of Shamerica, right? The period where everyone assumed that the unstoppable globalization of the world's economy would make China and the United States too deeply interdependent for either to act against the other, and that together they would sort of co-create this future. If you look at, even fiction from this era, like the science fiction TV show Firefly, it imagined a fusionist future where sort of America and China merge, not just economically, but culturally, politically. And this was also this last era where people still believed that eventually China would liberalize, that eventually China would become a democratic country, and in values, political values, social values, come to be much more similar to the United States. Now, after Xi ascended power, he didn't really stand with the Shanghai clique, which was this sort of regional, almost economic focused group. Rather, he removed people from both the Shanghai clique and the League clique, kind of dismantling what was starting to evolve into almost a two-party system, but within one party, right? The two tendencies were separate enough that it was meaningful to speak about political opposition inside the Communist Party of China, right? That was eliminated, and his staff he brought in was basically personnel that was loyal to him personally, right? He basically replaced party and government officials at the national, provincial, and even local levels with the assistance of this massive anti-corruption campaign. If people have been following news about Xi, they probably remember from 2012 to 2016, you could hear lots and lots of stories or examples of people being removed essentially on corruption charges. Now, first, to be clear, there is massive corruption inside of China, like no question about it. One of the most important things to always know about corruption is it economically productive corruption, where, say, a public official takes a large bribe and then the building permits that are, excessive, let's say, they don't need to be fulfilled quite as onerously. Or is it an extractive kind of corruption where, basically police officers are looking around the street and just trying to extort random citizens for bribes to do their job, or public officials, right, might need a bribe to have you start a company, etc., even though there should not really be any sort of added barrier to entry. This sort of productive and non-productive corruption, right, was happening at all scale of Chinese society. Because they were a rapidly growing society, there were so many positive sum opportunities that it was quite plausible for both the public official to receive a giant bribe and for the entrepreneur to still make a lot of money. As Chinese economic growth slowed, it was necessary to tamper down on some of that extractive corruption that was happening at all levels of the Chinese system. It suddenly became important to have a city's budget be balanced, for example, right? Or a provincial budget, or even the country's budget. One of the bigger things that Xi struggled with on a corruption level has been, in fact, corruption inside the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. China has been spending more and more money on its military. That doesn't mean that they're getting a better and better military over time. It is improving in peak technological capacities. It is improving in the amount of personnel, equipment, etc. But actually, the cost efficiency was probably going down for every single year from about 1994 all the way, I would say, until 2017, 2018. They undertook lots of projects that didn't work as expected, such as reverse engineering American or Russian designs for next generation fighters. When the reverse engineering was attempted, it was very expensive, and the engines caught on fire. And all of those things don't really matter if you expect double-digit economic growth. They begin to matter even for the public benefit once growth slows. So as growth slowed, extraction had to ease off. But it sure was convenient, right? That so many people at so many layers of Chinese society either were corrupt or could be presented as corrupt. And a measure that is not explicitly the make Xi Jinping the most powerful man in China, but rather is explicitly, hey, with slowing economic growth, we have to make sure that we're running an efficient ship here. That moral legitimacy of that campaign really contributed to the forcefulness, right? So politically, he was sort of in the right time and in the right place. I suspect some sort of inter-elite conflict would have happened anyway. One of these cliques would have won. But what instead seems to have happened is that neither of the cliques really won, and that the power became personalized. So even these political cliques themselves had more than one important person. They might be headed by a former president, but they would de facto be a kind of power sharing arrangement with whoever became the next president. In this current situation, for the first time in a long time, it's not actually clear who will succeed Xi Jinping. And that perhaps is China's greatest challenge. I think that the Communist Party is secure in its power over the country. Xi has basically completed most of the needed centralization of power. He has not yet succeeded in restarting or boosting economic growth, but perhaps he has managed to achieve some of his social reform programs, which were essentially aimed at reducing the disparities between the still massively underdeveloped inland hinterlands and like very poor and emptying rural areas, and some of the cities like Guangdong or Shenzhen or Shanghai, which honestly have at this point almost first world living standards. On the poorer end of the first world, of course, more comparable to Poland or Portugal than New York City, but still first world, right? There are about 50 to 80 million people, depending on how you count, that within China basically live on this Western level of consumption. So those inequalities, of course, inspire political tensions within the country because there are parts of China, they're no longer as poor as Africa, but there are many parts of China, large regions that are as poor as India, right? So these sorts of tensions have political currency and maybe even inspire some genuine conviction from him. Another aspect that people miss about Xi is that he has an earnest Marxist outlook, or let's say an earnest Chinese Marxist outlook, where it's not just that we are cynically holding on to power as we do capitalism. Rather, we are in the process of building socialism. And there is some distant point in the future where capitalism, as we think of it, is turned off. Because after all, this is what our theory predicts. Our theory predicts that capitalism will be very efficient at accumulating property. At some point, it will stop, and we will then have all the material abundance we needed to pursue communism. So the future of China depends heavily on whether the successor to Xi simply says, we are done with the capitalist phase of development. That sort of economic left-wing turn could happen at any point in China's political process, at any point in China's future political history, as long as there remains a deep enough cadre of people who are ideologically persuaded by this. I think it's harder to restart economic growth than it is to declare a failure a success. If you say we're growing at 4% a year, but we are actually so much more Marxist than we were 10 or 20 years ago, right? We've eliminated this sort of deviation of just minting so many Chinese billionaires and like having people still live in rural poverty, right? You can declare that actually it's not that our economy is growing more slowly, it's that we're achieving greater equality among our citizens. You can always say that. And of course, the Chinese government has not just been bragging about this, but it's been bragging about how environmentally friendly it is. So the same critiques we have in the Western world, or that I have put forward for the Western world, that a reduction in CO2 emissions is usually right now one of two things. It's either a relatively sunny country and they've picked up solar, or it is just another indication that real economic activity has gone down. Lower emissions just usually means less energy. Less energy usually means just less material stuff is getting done. And if the GDP stays high, the GDP is staying high as kind of like almost an accounting fiction, right? There's like a certain kind of inflation happening there. This is as true in China as it is in Germany, as it is in the United States. So the fact that they are bragging about clear skies over Beijing, one way to look at this is, okay, China's become richer. They've made their environmental regulations stricter. Another way to look at it is China's economy was hurt massively by COVID and to some extent even by the trade war, and demand for fossil fuels has gone down. And because demand has gone down, less fossil fuels get burned, and Beijing has blue skies again, right? So again, they have this like equality metric, and they have set honestly a reasonable target to have cleaner air in major Chinese cities. And either one of those goals can just be accomplished as a side effect of slowing growth. So there's a politically coherent way to present your fails as wins that they might come to use as a crutch.
Hey everybody, Eric here with a word from our sponsors. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search, Brave offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention MOZ when signing up for a 25% discount on your first campaign.
And so you paint China as kind of in a fork in the road as to how the succession of Xi Jinping will be played. Say more about the options as you see them, or perhaps more precisely about if you were a betting man and had to bet on the future direction that of how things play out, how would you think about making that bet?
I think that they will probably not go in this direction of like a renewed emphasis on nationalization, because they are already achieving most of what they need purely with this kind of individual or personal pressure. So there's a big difference whether an industrialist is expropriated or whether they are pressured to pursue or comply with a particular government policy. In South Korea, even the very much not communist dictator of the country in the 1970s just kind of got the heads of the big companies together, and he's like, you know what? This is my economic plan for the country. You're going to do this, or else you lose ownership of your company. Or possibly you're even imprisoned and beaten up. And that's like, of course, that's rough and tumble. That's not like respecting people's rights, but it is still vastly different than, okay, your company is nationalized and perhaps you have to flee the country and there is no sort of control that you can exert, and there is no property rights that you can enforce against the state. So because in China, things such as when Jack Ma was, when he was kind of disappeared, he never was formally arrested, I believe. He just was secluded from public view. No one knew his whereabouts. And when he returned in public, he basically stopped critiquing the financial policy of China's central bank. Jack Ma's company had basically tried to go into fintech and tried to basically essentially reform aspects of China's system. And they ran into, headlong into these policy imperatives coming from the Chinese Communist Party. But the very fact that someone as charismatic as Jack Ma, as wealthy and as influential, could be humbled, and that there was no direct expropriation needed, and there was no deep public slander campaign against him at the end of the day. There was not much reputation assassination. It was more like, it was less of there was no show trial, right? The very fact of that, to me, suggests that while Xi's successor will probably not be able to return to the era of double-digit growth, they will also likely not opt for nationalization. Therefore, the Chinese economy and its political system is probably going to evolve to be something closer to, say, contemporary South Korea's model. In modern South Korea, unlike the South Korea of the 70s, while the CEO of the Samsung Group might still be imprisoned, there's no more central economic directive coming from the state. There are just these various partnerships where they are trying to support their national champion in achieving certain kinds of export goals, and also, of course, protecting them from domestic competition and hoping that the economies of scale basically swamp out anything that's lost from disruption. Because, the whole creative destruction rationale. My bet then is very much on a balancing act by Xi's successor, but the risk is significant. And in that sort of situation, you could have a turn in Chinese government back towards a more totalitarian system, which I think existed under Mao, and which, of course, still to this day exists in North Korea.
Makes sense. And so zooming out a bit, if Xi was to pass away today, say more about what his legacy would be on broader China. I know that answer is different than if he passed away a few years ago, sort of before COVID, or if he passed away maybe a few years from now. But why don't we take a stab at saying more about sort of his comprehensive legacy?
I would say that I actually expect Xi to not pass away anytime soon. He's in basically good health. I think we can expect him to stick around for up to a decade or more. If he were to pass away today, I think his legacy would be keeping the Chinese Communist Party in control, being relatively actually restrained with the United States. Here's another thing people miss. People think that Xi is the one pushing for confrontation. I actually think that it is people at most levels of Chinese government, and especially in their foreign service, that at this point feel China is powerful and be a peer to the United States. It must have taken a decision from Xi to support Russia, let's say, in only a very limited way, rather than fully back Russia, on the assumption that a loss for the United States in supporting Ukraine is a win for China, right? Not just a win for Russia. So despite having very positive relations with Vladimir Putin, he in fact did not back him overtly. That's quite important. Even the economic ties that China has undertaken, there are several Chinese institutions that have, to a limited extent, decided that trade with the Western world is more important than trade with Russia, and have suspended their operations in Russia. This, of course, is simultaneously to, the sanctions already didn't work. However, the fact that there's no line within China that you must do business with Russia for geopolitical reasons, that's already showing that the support was, I wouldn't even call it lukewarm. I'd say just like nominal, almost cold shoulder support. It's like, what is the minimum amount of support we can give to Russia so that we are not seen in Russia as actively siding against them, right? So that's number one. He has still kept China free of basically international entanglements. All the talk of the Belt and Road Initiative has actually sort of fizzled out because in an important way, China has not intervened politically in any of these countries where they've built ports and roads and rail. I actually think that a lot of these projects, rather than being immediately aimed at creating sort of a dependency, right, a political reason to say topple a government that has nationalized a large port that was previously owned by a Chinese company to keep that port owned by a Chinese company, I think a lot of it was just this sort of thinking that actually China is in the business of globalization. And the more infrastructure we build in the poor parts of Asia, the more products we will sell both there, but the easier it will be to get our products to all parts of the world. And we will have an alternative in case ever the Straits of Malacca are closed, and if ever it is, blockaded, the coastal region of China ever is blockaded, there will be an inland alternative. So it was also just a big waste of money because Chinese capital needed somewhere to go. They needed something to invest in. And I think it's telling that they couldn't find enough profitable investments inside of China. It used to be the case that the West would sink capital we didn't know what to do with in China. And now China's sinking capital it doesn't know what to do with in East Africa and Central Asia, Western Asia. Some places they, of course, also have done investments in European countries, such as Italy. Now, this doesn't mean that there is no political pull that has happened, but Xi has not embarked on a real campaign of imperialism. So that would be point number one. Did not entangle with Russia beyond reason. Point number two, has not pursued the creation of new client states. And then point number three, it's sort of like ideologically, he has been kind of an anti-liberal. He has pursued, he's basically closed this very narrow door that maybe still existed as late as 2005 or 7 for the Communist Party to evolve further in the direction of incorporating democratic elements, or possibly even allowing the sister parties. Technically China has several sister parties that are in, a legally binding coalition with the Chinese Communist Party. So anyway, these smaller parties could have been allowed to be competitive on at least the local and eventually the national level in the elections that do happen in the Chinese system. That is now almost like ideologically closed. It's sort of like, instead of possibly in the future, as we become more equal, we will also become more democratic. That is no longer the stated aim. There's perhaps still an aim to achieve the social equality, but the argument isn't that there's some sort of democracy deficit that the CCP has to overcome. The view is that what we've achieved is a good system of government, and we're going to stick with it for the foreseeable future. The main thing we have to fix is corruption. And if we fix corruption, well, we got a stable and working government. And then all we really have to do is just become wealthier and make sure that the wealth is equally distributed. So that's important as well, right? It was very much in the 1990s, there was a harsh security state measure against democracy. In the 2000s, there was the possibility of reforming towards democracy. Now that possibility, I think, is closed. And if democracy comes to China, I think it will be the result of substantial and deep political failure by the CCP. So I would not expect it to happen anytime in the next 20 years. So basically, he has secured the power of the party. The open questions, though, are what has he done to the talent base of the party? And it's not very clear that you can eliminate important political rivals, run a massive anti-corruption campaign, stay an orthodox Marxist, and actually recruit useful new talent into the party. So the technocratic quality of members of the Chinese Communist Party, something that people still sort of admired in the 2012 era, but of course people became disenchanted with during the COVID era, where they were shown to be even slightly worse technocrats than the worst bureaucrats we have to offer. That sort of quality of decision making might go down significantly. Now, at the provincial government, there's still provinces that are pursuing decent economic development. And then, since we're talking about it, I think that sort of the Uyghur people will probably rightly just consider him like a key national enemy. It's not clear anyone else will care, not in a deep way, and that's unfortunate. But for the Uyghur people, at least, their language and culture will basically massively reduce in importance, right? So even if not that many people even if they let up the re-education campaigns now and released everyone from internment now, I don't think Uyghur culture will ever recover in China.
Another thing, speaking of sort of talent-based, another thing you've written about is sort of the relationship between Xi Jinping and Jack Ma, and more broadly, sort of the billionaire class or private enterprise. What should be said about that in terms of making sense of what's been happening there, and what are the impacts of that?
Basically, I think that the interpretation of Xi as an orthodox Marxist really helps here, where I think he sort of views Chinese billionaires as guilty until proven innocent, rather than innocent until proven guilty. And that's a great departure from how entrepreneurs were treated in China in the early 2000s. He was explicit in his intent to defeat hostile forces arrayed against China, right? And, he basically was convinced that there is a plutocratic risk to the way China is run, where especially like the new wealth that has no tie to the party, they do not owe their wealth to any political connection inside the Chinese party. Rather, they owe their wealth to actually just free market competition, both within China and internationally. That class had to be, in his opinion, humbled. Jack Ma, on the other hand, was in a way almost a much more enlightened technocrat in this sense than any member of the Communist Party. He was seeing purely technical problems with how the financial system is run, technical problems with what's happening with the software and hardware ecosystem, culture, and regulatory environment in China. And he tried to speak up against them, which in theory you can do. So it's not even that he ever went as far as to challenge Communist Party rule. He was just saying these are bad policies, right? And that was sort of enough to get him in this problematic situation. I think that basically, there was also like a cultural element to this, where China's elite universities have been becoming more important in China, right? But what people don't know is that Jack Ma used to basically run an elite business academy, Huapan University, and they were ordered in early 2021 to suspend new enrollments in China. So basically, this business school, which you could see in two lights, right? One way you could see it is this is where the next generation of Chinese entrepreneurs will come from, right? There was, of course, popularity and demand in China to enroll. And the other way you can look at it is, wait, this is now an education nexus that is not tied to the CCP and means they'll just mint businessmen who feel that maybe they love this university, but they don't really necessarily love the party. The party never did anything for them. Jack Ma did something for them, right? That sort of civil society engagement, which we take sort of for granted in the Western world. I could joke, but say like, in the West, a billionaire funding a university is almost like a human right, right? It is a human right. That sort of move to like any sort of socially reformist philanthropy of the kind that, Peter Thiel or Patrick Collison engage in, that has been foreclosed. Any sort of improvement to society will come from the top. It'll not come from the middle. And of course, it won't come from the bottom. It won't come from the people through any sort of democratic mechanism. So that actually leaves, sort of the already rich in China very little to do. They either join the Communist Party or they engage in like basically the most harmless kind of philanthropy you can imagine, like earthquake relief money or something like that. Because if they do anything else, their position is risked, right? And that, I think, keeps them in a permanently strained position. And it also means that there is another barrier to China evolving away from the party state model towards something like an active civil society. Because to have, in like a Republican context, any kind of civil society, it necessarily involves both power to the people and power to the oligarchs. Like you have to do both, right? You have to have you have these foundations that are funded by the wealthy, supported by the wealthy, and you have more grassroots things, and these often rely on the same infrastructure. And in China, neither of those infrastructures is really developed, and it all has to come through party connections and official government decisions. So that, I think, limits the amount of pushback China will ever experience for bad policy. And like I said, it limits technocratic insight from people like Ma. I think that there was also sorry, are we still recording? The screen kind of glitched out.
Yes, we are.
Okay, sorry. But to say a little bit more about it, Xi has basically caused a structural change in China's elite and institutions, where basically the rising prestige of the entrepreneur was permanently capped. And Ma was sort of hoping that there could be this purely visionary or economic or technocratic form of leadership, because that would best fit his personality, arguably better than ascending the ranks. I actually think this is in some ways a shame for China, because whether they want to or not, they will be selecting for conformity at every level of promotion. Xi himself is sort of among the last people of a generation where it was not really possible. Where you couldn't really get vast wealth by being anything but a top communist official. I think in modern China, just as a government official, it's possible to get quite wealthy. You're not supposed to be open about it, but it definitely can be done because the country is much richer than it used to be. And because he has this still personal experience of poverty, like basically from his youth, right? He has this understanding that the economic growth has value in itself. So even while needing to explain away some of these problems with growth, he has this attitude that we're never going to go back to the poverty of like the era he grew up in. And also there's some experiences he had under Mao that are, rather under, this period of the Cultural Revolution, where he sort of is like not quite inclined to go back to struggle sessions and sort of student-led activism. Like there is a period where, his own family sort of was hit in this process of the Cultural Revolution and like suffered setbacks. So I don't think he wants to return to like sort of the era of Maoist style agitation. That is a generational fact, right? It's true of all the Chinese boomers. So the Chinese boomers, they don't like Mao. They sort of like Deng. They sort of still feel we should be trying to do communism, but they prioritize wealth over it. The next generation, more corrupt. They come often from princeling families. So that's like a term for families where the son achieves a senior position because his father had a senior position. So you now have second or third or fourth generation Chinese communist officials. That is another barrier potentially to accepting new talent. It's another filter for conformity. So you could have a future where, and I think too few people talk about this future, a future with a powerful China that continues to grow, that actually is a bigger economy than it is today, but it doesn't overshadow the whole Western world collectively. It might overshadow the United States, but it doesn't beat the US plus Japan plus, NATO, right? Even in terms of raw economic potential. And it sort of becomes this dysfunctional and stagnant place where, okay, maybe the drug addiction problem never develops to the extent that we see it here in San Francisco, but perhaps the fertility falls, and perhaps it falls as low as that of South Korea or even further. Usually I'm the one to, say that China's demographic collapse is exaggerated, but it really doesn't have much margin for significant further reductions in their fertility, right? So if it got even worse, in that case, it would just grind to a halt any sort of economic progress. But honestly, maybe that's fine for the United States. Maybe it's fine for the US that in 20 years, China will not be able to afford to double its military budget once more, right? Perhaps they'll all have to spend it on retirement.
If you were Xi Jinping's advisor and could help think through the success problem or anything else as he thinks about kind of his remaining years in office or in leadership, walk us through how you would advise him or some of the biggest things you think he should be thinking about that may not be obvious.
I think that one of the best things he could do is elevate much younger people than average. So even if they are nepotistic hires, I think it is important to put some 50-year-olds or 40-year-olds in positions of power, not just people in their 60s. And of course, this will involve angering a whole generation that's been waiting their turn after Xi. But I think especially for a notably aging country, it is important to have anything at all go in an anti-gerontocratic direction. I know this is one of my regular beats, but it is really true almost all over the world, except sub-Saharan Africa and to a lesser extent, India. I think that humans, we tend to value the proven. We tend to also value deep social interconnection. So we value people with big networks. And guess what? It takes a lifetime to build a big network of people that you know. And they're compounding gains. In my career, I've experienced this. I'm sure you've experienced it in your career as a venture capitalist, that year on year, your network just keeps getting better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, currently the Politburo has reached the limit of what I think can be done with purely like technical sort of procedural anti-corruption campaigns. I think the trickiest part for Xi would be defining a role for elites in China that is distinct from membership in the Chinese Communist Party. I think he has to do this because otherwise, in the long run, two things that he fears will happen. Number one, he thinks that the core problem of the Soviet Union was that, in a way, the communists stopped believing in communism. So everyone only joined the Soviet Communist Party as a careerist move, right? So as soon as economic stagnation hit and some geopolitical pressure, including low oil prices in the 1980s, the whole system sort of fell apart, and there was opportunistic infighting. What people today forget is that, Gorbachev was sort of cooed by Boris Yeltsin, who was the still then nominally very communist head of the Russian component of this federal system that was the Soviet Union, that sort of overthrew his boss, right? Gorbachev was basically Yeltsin's boss. So that I would count as elite infighting, whatever else is happening ideologically on top of the elite struggle. So ironically, that might happen if you make the Communist Party monopolize all talent in the country. There's no way 100% of your elites are persuaded Marxists. That's just impossible, right? Even if Marxism were true, even if your brand of Marxism made China the richest country in the world, come on, there's a natural spread of belief. I'm sure in America, not everyone's actually persuaded democracy works, right? To give an example, right, of how good your argument could be, right? So that's number one. It actually might ironically lead to the dissolution of the party, which he would worry about, into this kind of totally dead, directionless, non-ideological instrument. And I'm not even opposed to pragmatism, but I do think that when you have a party state, either the kind that China has or something that has a more democratic element combined in it, like the Singaporean government does, you need direction, because perspectiveless technocracy always satisfies. It never maximizes, optimizes, or jumps over an adaptive valley. So in that case, China will be stuck in the paradigm of 2010, let's say, and it'll never ever leave it. And it almost doesn't matter if the direction is, as long as the direction is not actively destructive, as long as there's some impulse, right? Because then you can justify changes. The other aspect of it is, unless there is talent developed outside of the Communist Party, China will never have a scientific culture that will be as excellent as what we still find in some corners of the Western world. It's definitely decayed, both in Britain, Germany, Sweden, and America, but it's leagues better. Our academic science is just much better on average than China's academic science. So if what happens in China, which is the fusion of an Ivy League university-like system, which of course selects for very smart and conformist people, with the Communist Party, which has now become selection for conformist and sometimes born in the right family people, if these two are just merged, the Chinese Communist Party inevitably kind of destroys the possibility of excellent scientific work being valued. Because in no university anywhere in China will the highest status person be a scientist rather than the academic with the best CCP connections. You have to create this reservoir, and it doesn't have to be within universities, but it certainly has to be outside of power, where it's possible to be the highest status and most trusted authority just because of your insight into reality, and not because of your power or political usefulness. So these two reasons, I bet if I could talk to Xi about this, he'd actually even agree and find them compelling. Now, there are other pieces of advice I could give where, Xi maybe believes in science and maybe believes in keeping the party ideological and having a direction rather than being non-directional. There are other pieces of advice I could give that wouldn't be so much advice, but just us having different values and different politics, right? So I'm not gonna list those. I'm assuring the listeners, though, that there are some.
Totally. And when you say he believes in science, do you mean to say you don't mean to say you don't believe in science, or I guess what do you mean by that?
Well, I believe it's possible to understand the natural world, and I believe it's possible to come through this empirical and theoretical process. And I even believe it's possible to do science in universities, right? So I am a bit contrarian. I don't by default equate academia with the scientific method or even the history of science, which was often these very informal networks of people like, Isaac Newton, right? Isaac Newton was head of the mint, right? Like he was literally finance minister, basically, right? At a certain point in his career. And other times you were just you had self-funded gentlemen like Charles Darwin do pretty good science, I think, much later. So I do think we are wrong in that. I think she believes in the scientific method. And this is another quirk, Marxism is a Western ideology, even if we don't want to claim it. And at least notionally, it deeply endorses objectivity. Their view is science says these people are economic parasites and these people are economically productive. So we're going to side with the economically productive people and eliminate the parasites. And if I don't define who the parasites or the productive people are, this could be any number of ideologies, right? And I'm being a little bit mean because even Marxists wouldn't put it in quite those harsh terms. I just feel that it's tended to work out that way in the 20th century, and it's been a big justification for political violence. So I don't want to whitewash that. I want to center that. But having said that, even if you're supremely critical of it, it's just impossible to have that worldview without being some kind of a materialist. And I think he is a real materialist in the sense of he thinks human reason can reorder the natural world and because if he doesn't believe that, how does he believe human reason can reorder society. If he doesn't believe that, how does he go to sleep at night, right? How does he justify his own system that he's on top of? So I think he would be very concerned if it was pointed out to him that the current architecture of Chinese society is not compatible with developing a high quality tradition of scientific inquiry. It's very compatible with picking up new scientific knowledge, but not necessarily at creating it. And here would be my final pessimistic take. If China wishes to grow, it's run out of stuff to copy from the West. It has to go and find its own science. Maybe it'll be, a little copper, maybe a little part of copper will actually float this time, right? Maybe there'll be a Chinese lab that actually invents room temperature superconductors 4 years from now. Or maybe Chinese computer scientists will succeed at breaking encryption, and suddenly all cryptocurrencies will be worthless and all Western communication will be easily intercepted and China will reap the benefits. But whatever it is, the thing that would actually make China the hegemon, no matter its demographics, would just be some sort of fundamental, applicable scientific breakthrough. And unfortunately, it's less and less likely that the US gets it first, right? These days, it's sort of like the US is slowing down. And I think that for it to arrive in time before the demographic crunch, China's quality, the quality of its science, has to improve massively in the coming decades.
That's a good place to wrap, because in future episodes we'll be doing a bit of a series on China. We'll go into their defense industry, some of their advanced technology like nuclear, quantum, automation, their space program, some of the major companies. So this is that's a great segue to what we'll be covering in future episodes. With that, Samo, as always, a great discussion, and until next time.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen.